Good evening. My name is Sarah Niebler, and I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department here at Dickinson College. On behalf of the department, we want to welcome you to the Bruce R. Andrews Lecture in Political Science. Bruce taught in our department from 1960 until his retirement in 1992. His research and teaching were in American politics, focusing on public opinion, mass media, and political behavior. You can read about Bruce's distinguished career at Dickinson in the program and on the Clark Forum's website, but I wanted to offer a few words about Bruce's time in the department passed along to me by one of Bruce's and my former colleagues, Mark Rule, who's here with us this evening. Mark says, quote, "I've never in my life known a more fair-minded person than Bruce Andrews. He bent over backwards to understand the points of view of people with whom he disagreed, but he was not easily swayed from his convictions or from policy views he had taken years to form. I also haven't known many better listeners than Bruce Andrews. If you had a problem, he would hear you out at length and come up with useful ideas, and he'd kindly let you know that whatever it was probably didn't mean the end of the world." This is one of the reasons he was always faculty advisor to about 1,000 students at a time. Year after year, they used to line the hallway outside his office for his advice and counsel. While Bruce's wife, Marjorie, and his children, Stephen, Mary Margaret, and Carolyn, were unable to join us in person tonight, but we hope they're watching via live stream, we are pleased to welcome one of Bruce's former students, Rob Palmer, class of 1974, and Rob's wife, Sharon, to campus today on behalf of the Andrews family. The Political Science Department at Dickinson College is grateful to Bruce's family and friends for endowing the Bruce R. Andrews Fund that allows us to bring speakers to campus who discuss topics that honor Bruce's teaching, scholarship, and love of political science. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Niebler. Good evening. My name is Noah Salsic, and I'm a student project manager for the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues, and I'm also a political science major here at Dickinson. Before we start, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the Dickinson College on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as 1,000 indigenous children forced in the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, the Bruce R. Andrews Lecture, and the Department of Political Science, I welcome you all to tonight's event, Sueño Americano or Sueño Republicano, Latino Voters in 2020, 2022, and beyond. The poster I designed for tonight's event features 3 headlines from major news organizations, each mentioning voting trends among Latinx voters and how they're changing. They represent just a few of the wide variety of articles written about tonight's topic recently. Are Latinos really realigning towards Republicans? Democrats are losing Latino voters as Republicans eye opportunities these midterms. And GOP gaining support among Black and Latino voters, WSJ poll finds. These are just a few titles, but titles such as these illustrate how the trends are important and they're noticeable and they're showing up in our news, but there's also a sense that we don't quite know what the driving forces are. Political science, to me, can offer a reasoned and informed perspective to that speculation and isolated trends that I sometimes find in modern news. When I came to Dickinson last year, I didn't yet know what I wanted my major to be, but I knew I wanted to pursue my interest in politics, at least in some respect. In my first semester, I took an American government class in the political science department with Professor O'Connell, and I just loved it. I was fascinated by the professor's understanding of the nuances of political science, and not only political science, but the nuances of voter turnout and polarization. In that first class, I learned that political science could uncover a far more complex reality than what I often saw depicted in modern news. And so I'm super excited to see what is going to be talked about tonight. Today, I'm a political science major, as I mentioned, and I'm also very lucky to have Professor O'Connell as my advisor. Dr. Fraga tonight will use national survey data, precinct returns, and voter file records to illustrate the factors influencing Latinx voters and their voter trends, and to comment on that lasting impact. Dr. Fraga is an associate professor of political science at Emory University and a scholar of American elections. He is the author of the award-winning book, The Turnout Gap, Race, Ethnicity, and Political Inequality in a Diversifying America, which analyzes race and voter turnout through a lens of political inequality. His work has also been featured in outlets such as the New York Times, The Economist, and the Washington Post. Beyond his written work, Dr. Fraga advises organizations aiming to further American civic and democratic electoral engagement, and has served as an expert witness in a number of voting rights and electoral cases, which I actually talked about in my interview today. I was lucky to interview him. There will be a question and answer session immediately following tonight's program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed thoughtfully, succinctly, and politely, but as always, disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. Harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or the audience will also not be tolerated. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones, electronic devices, and as a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of emergency, accessible exits are available right behind me, the west. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fraga to the podium.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. It's an honor to be here at Dickinson and to be speaking to you all tonight. It's also an honor, and I got to learn a little bit more about Professor Andrews at a reception we had right before this event. It's also an honor to be speaking as part of the Bruce Andrews lecture series, right? I learned that Professor Andrews, one of his most popular courses was titled Public Opinion and Political Propaganda. I don't teach a class like that, but I'm hoping in today's lecture you get a little bit more public opinion and a little bit less political propaganda in what you hear. But I'll let you decide that, and you can grill me in the Q&A if you disagree. So in today's talk, I'm going to be discussing co-authored research that I'm doing with Professor Emily West over at University of Pittsburgh and Professor Yamil Velez over at Columbia University, a project that we started actually before the 2020 election, when polling was indicating that Latino voters were trending more Republican than the literature would have suggested was possible. And this is a project that we're continuing to refine and work on, going through the peer review publication process. But as we saw with the result of the 2020 election and the 2022 election even, there are some really notable and I think important to scrutinize trends in Latino voting that might also have big implications for the future of American politics more broadly. So I want to begin really with the 2020 election, the lead up to the 2020 election, and the narratives that were out there at the time. It seemed like there was a growth in at least the potential for, at that time, incumbent President Donald Trump to make inroads with Latino voters. This was highlighted especially in places like Florida, also in places like Texas, areas with a relatively diverse Latino population that, while not favoring Trump in terms of majority in 2016, seemed to be trending in his direction given policy priorities, discussions of rise in socialism in South America, and other factors, but factors that defied conventional explanations. Now, just to recap the academic literature on Latino voters very briefly, I'm happy to return to it in the Q&A if you're curious. We know from the literature that Latinos, despite those trends, are generally Democratic-leaning. And this is true in both vote choice, that is who Latinos tend to vote for in, for example, a presidential election like 2020, and in longer-term party identification. And for the non-political science majors, and I know you have a fantastic political science department here, so you should take a class in political science, but party identification is this kind of long-standing attachment to the parties that persists beyond election-to-election trends, a psychological attachment to parties that is why probably all of you in this room can say whether you're a Democrat or Republican, even without knowing which candidates I'm talking about or which election I'm referring to. In addition, the literature has identified the latent potential, so unrealized potential, for Republican gains with Latino voters in particular. And this latent potential is usually identified as stemming from the religious proclivities of the Latino population being heavily Catholic, somewhat anti-abortion because of that Catholicism, even the growing evangelical Latino population in the US, also anti-abortion, also a kind of a family values rhetoric, even kind of an American dream rhetoric that exists among Latino immigrants and their descendants. These have been seen as opportunities for Republicans to make gains if they just found the right way of focusing on those issues where Latinos might be turned away from the Democrats and toward the Republicans. But of course, in recent years, the idea is the Republicans have done the opposite. That Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and actions once gaining office in 2016 were anathema to Latino voters, and in fact facilitated the counter-mobilization by Democrats of Latinos, ensuring that they would be a solid part of the Democratic base. Now, just to recap a little bit of what occurred between kind of Trump announcing office and the 2020 election that seems to fit in with that literature. If you remember Donald Trump descending on a golden elevator at a Trump property, July 2015, announcing his run for president, in his very first speech, inflammatory rhetoric regarding Latinos and Mexican immigrants in particular. When Mexico is sending its people, they're not sending their best, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Calling out Mexican immigrants, and again, Mexicans and Mexican Americans are 70% of the Latino population in the US today who is voting eligible. Some, I assume, are good people. Pundits, Republicans, and Democrats said his campaign is over even before it's begun, with those comments specifically. January 2017, Trump is elected in November, takes office in January 2017. 2 executive orders, top of his list. One, what was called the Muslim ban at the time, preventing migration or even visits from majority Muslim countries, and executive orders reinforcing and reinstating, right, the deportation of individuals living in the US who had not committed crimes and previously were subject to a kind of deferred action plan. November 2018, if you remember, after months of indicating that there were migrant caravans that were moving from Central America and southern Mexico to the US-Mexico border, tear gas deployed across the border wall against those migrant caravans, right? Photos like this being used in the media. Finally, the beginning, kind of the launching point of thinking about Trump's re-election campaign, doubling down on the immigration rhetoric that was used in 2016, introducing an immigration plan that even for the most conservative Republicans, they had to acknowledge was dead in the water when it got to, at the time, Republican Congress, using a point system, favoring highest skilled workers, but also using patriotic assimilation, favoring immigrants who already knew English. No relief for the DACA population, the Dreamer population, and of course, building more border wall with federal funding since Mexico wasn't going to pay for it. The surprise then, among both pundits and academics, when exit poll data coming out on election night in 2020 indicated that Donald Trump had not only done the same with Latinos as he did in 2016, but had actually done better with Latino voters than he did in his first election campaign, improving his margins with Latinos to a degree even more than any other racial group in the country. The first response, and I remember because I was on the phone that day analyzing election results, talking to the media, was, this can't be true. There must be a problem with the exit polls. There must be, and there are many problems with the exit polls, but there must be some issues with the polling or who's getting asked. It was the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe it was some issue with the voters. But it was true. The most authoritative estimates we have so far of voting trends by race and ethnicity, and also looking at college versus non-college whites, right? Looking across the last 3 presidential elections, indicate that Donald Trump, while declining in performance, this is Joe Biden's vote share among key demographic groups modeled with a mix of survey data, voter file data, really the best estimates that we have of change over the last 3 presidential elections, indicates that Donald Trump did worse among whites. That is, Joe Biden improved his vote margin going from 2016 to 2020. Donald Trump did better among African Americans and Latinos, slightly better maybe among the Asian American Pacific Islander population, but generally worse among non-Hispanic whites. But look at this, 8 percentage points better with the Latino population. Joe Biden did 8 percentage points worse than Hillary Clinton did in 2016 with Latinos, and despite that, was able to win office and defeat Donald Trump. This is the mystery that many political scientists, myself included, even before, but certainly since the 2020 election, have been trying to explain. Why, given everything that I just showed you, did Trump do better with Latino voters? In fact, better margins relative to 2016 than any other racial and ethnic group in the country. That's the focus of the project. Why did Latino support for Trump increase in 2020? And then extending that forward, will that increase in support transfer to other Republicans going forward? Or was it specific to the many factors that we're still living with, especially the pandemic, of the 2020 election cycle? Now, in order to address this question as fully as possible, we're using multiple data sources. We're using national survey data with over 75,000 unique Latino respondents. In addition, individual level turnout records for the millions of Americans nationwide who cast ballots in the 2016 and 2020 elections, neighborhood or precinct level election results, and, as I'm a quantitative scholar primarily in my political science research, using methods of statistical analysis to try and understand and make educated guesses where necessary about changes in Latino voting behavior between 2016 and 2020. Focusing especially on shifting support for Biden versus Trump in the course of the 2020 campaign, thinking about the Latinos who voted for Clinton in 2016 but then shifted and voted for Trump in 2020, and importantly, those Latinos who might have actually been activated and mobilized to vote for the first time because Donald Trump was on the ballot in 2020. So that's the focus again of this co-authored project. I'm going to be talking about some of the findings from that project in tonight's talk. It'll have 4 parts. First, examining this question of whether this was a 2020 specific phenomenon. Second, thinking about which Latino subgroups, national origin, age, gender, and also issue priorities shifted towards Trump. Where do we see geographically a concentration of Latinos who shifted their support towards Trump in 2020 relative to 2016 and overall? And then finally, this bigger question, did Republicans continue to make gains with Latinos in 2022, and what does that point to for 2024 and beyond? Okay, so 4 parts of this talk. Again, mostly descriptive findings, thinking about what the data can tell us, but with some really important, as I mentioned, implications for broader American politics and the future of not just Latino voting behavior, but American elections. Okay, first part, was it 2020 specific? To get at this question, we're using a combination of some really interesting survey data from the Democracy Fund and UCLA, their Nationscape weekly polling data. Throughout the 2020 campaign season, even before the primary elections began, every week they were polling thousands of Americans in a rolling kind of panel survey trying to understand how opinion was shifting during the course of the campaign. This is before the pandemic, and that ended up dominating the news cycle, but at the time, the idea was this would be a really great data source to understand people's changing behaviors and attitudes during the 2020 campaign season. Now, overall, they had hundreds of thousands of respondents, but about 70,000 unique Latino respondents polled between July 2019 and February 2021. So this is a very large data set. Most national polls, single shot, about 1,000 to 1,500 respondents total, maybe 300 Latinos in the mix there, 400. This is 70,000 respondents. And what we're looking at here is changes in Biden versus Trump two-way support every month in every state for the Latino population specifically. Now the question, it's really great that they were asking this even back in 2019, was as follows. If the election for president was going to be held now, and the Democratic nominee was Joe Biden and the Republican nominee was Donald Trump, would you vote for Donald Trump, Joe Biden, someone else? I wouldn't vote, or I'm not sure. We're focusing on people who said Trump or Biden, contrasting Latino and non-Latino shifts during the campaign season. When you have a big poll with lots of questions, you can do things like this. I'm not going to pull out the Bernie Sanders version of this question, but even before Joe Biden was going to be the nominee, they were asking this, so we can look and see the direct Biden-Trump matchup all the way from 2019 to the election. And here's what that looks like. The dark black line here that you see, right, is pointing to the mean across all states in Latino support for Biden in a Biden-Trump matchup over time. And the gray lines here indicate this is a modeled kind of monthly state moving average for each state. So the states tended to move together in terms of Latino opinion for Trump versus Biden over time. And I've highlighted here two kind of time points, right, that many people feel would have been places where there was kind of an inflection point, a big shift in support for Biden versus Trump. The COVID-19 lockdowns, April 2020, and the BLM protests that occurred at the end of May of 2020 as well. And what we see is that while Latino support for Biden declined over most of the campaign season, if anything, it kind of leveled off around the time of the COVID-19 lockdowns and the BLM protests. And you can insert any other kind of things that were happening at that time. Joe Biden secured the Democratic nomination just about the time of the COVID-19 kind of pandemic really hitting American shores, and certainly by the time of the lockdowns, primary elections were canceled. You could talk about everything that happened over the summer, but if anything, it looks like that might have actually caused a little bit of an increase in Latino support for Biden over time. So, little evidence of a drop that is things that were kind of 2020 specific, transient features, like COVID-19. We're done with that, right? This is a joke. COVID-19 lockdowns, though, which disproportionately impacted Latinos, or the BLM protests, where there was a lot of media, as I'll mention, indicating that Latinos were alienated from a Democratic Party that was increasingly embracing the demands of Black Lives Matter. Now, contrast that with white support, and you can see overall white or non-Latino, which is predominantly white, support for Biden over time, it's lower on average, right? But a similar kind of trend of decline and then maybe a little bit of an increase in the spring and summer, but again, not much. A lot of state variation, but not much indicating that those kind of key 2020 moments really made a big dent in the overall average national trend over time, or even the state level averages either. So Latinos and non-Latinos, and I could flip these like back and forth so you can see, and then mess up my presentation as a result, but not much of a change there. Now, again, this is in the face of narratives even right before Election Day that said that Latino opposition to Black Lives Matter was the reason why there was a decline in Latino support for Democrats and Joe Biden in particular. Of course, you had articles arguing the opposite, saying that Black Lives Matter protests were going to solidify the Democratic base against Donald Trump, Latinos included in that, which didn't really happen either. And then, of course, the pandemic, which disproportionately impacted communities of color, in particular, Black, Native, and Latino communities. Of course, it hit all of us. Didn't seem to lead to disproportionate changes in Latino support for Biden versus Trump. Okay, so first part doesn't look like it's 2020 specific. 2, which Latinos switched to Trump? Which Latinos in particular contributed to the gains that Trump made with the Latino community in 2020 relative to 2016? Now, the simple approach, which has been the convention in political science for decades, I mean, this is what I learned to do, is to just contrast the change in the percent voting for Trump among different subgroups, maybe like Latinas versus Latino men, or looking at like highly educated Latinos versus lower socioeconomic status Latinos, just the percent voting for Trump and the percent voting for Biden versus the percent voting for Hillary and Trump in 2016. That's still really useful, but the latest kind of ways of thinking about this indicate some problems with that approach, especially when we're talking about Latinos. 2020 saw record levels of voter turnout across racial and ethnic groups. Large portions of the electorate voting for the first time, even though they could have voted before. In addition, the Latino electorate is so quickly growing, so dynamic, so much turnover. About 11% of the Latino electorate in any given cycle is completely newly eligible for the first time, right? About half in an 8-year period are turning over, right, and completely new. So much change in the electorate. And the fact that changes in attitudes and changes in demographics more broadly in the Latino community, some induced by the COVID pandemic in terms of unemployment, income, socioeconomic status, all of that combined means that just comparing percentage change in support is kind of missing the picture about where Trump might have made gains. Maybe he made gains with new voters who couldn't even vote before, or voters who were newly of a lower socioeconomic status, or had shifting attitudes. So instead, we're drawing on some new research that's forthcoming colleagues of mine, Justin Grimmer over at Stanford, Will Marble, also formerly of Stanford, and Tenagawa Lau, right, who I believe is at a think tank, this concept of net votes. There's a scary equation that I'll show you that I won't go through in a minute, but it's a big statistical equation, but the simple version of it is it's just trying to think about how much more or less did a group, in this case a Latino subgroup, contribute to Trump's share of the vote relative to 2016. This accounts for those changes in turnout, changes in vote choice, and changes in composition of the population altogether, and says, how many kind of new, right, votes did Trump win that he didn't win in 2016 from the Latino community? Right? This is the paper. You can go and find it online. It's actually a really nice read because it has fun equations like this. Let me just go through I'm just kidding. No algebra today. But if you're really interested, we can go over this in the Q&A. It's 3 simple parts, just subtracted and then divided. Anyway. Okay, so we're calculating this net change for different Latino subgroups. And this is really important. It's subgroups of the Latino population specifically. Right? For example, Latinas versus Latino men, as I mentioned, ideological groups, so liberal Latinos versus conservative. All the focus is on changes among, again, the Latino population where we saw these disproportionate gains by Trump in 2020. Using cooperative election study data for 2016 and 2020 here. Smaller N, but still relatively sizable relative to other national kind of polls, about 7,000 in each election cycle. We're reweighting this to make sure it's representative, of course, and importantly, we have really good measures of voter turnout because the CES actually validates who votes and who doesn't. Some of you know this from your classes probably, or if you've looked at my work. When you register to vote, that's public information. And whether or not you vote is also public. In almost every state, you can acquire that information as a member of public, like a phone book, if you all remember what that was, right? Some folks are laughing. I appreciate it. You can see whether or not you vote. Not how you vote, but whether or not you voted. So they actually validate the survey. People lie about whether or not they voted. This is validated information, so we can know for sure that they actually turned out. And I'm focusing here on core attitudinal and demographic factors, again, Latinos only. So let me show you this first on demographics. I'll start with a simple one. This is on gender. So for women here on the left and men here on the right, this is the increase in the net Trump votes as like a proportion. So like this would be a 1% or a 2% increase in terms of the overall share Trump got from these different groups relative to 2016. Extending out from the circular point estimates here is a 95% bootstrap confidence interval, indicating uncertainty in those estimates, and it crosses over the 0 line. So what that really means is for either women or for men, we can't really tell for sure that Trump made disproportionate gains among women versus men or the converse. It looks like he basically did the same in terms of net votes he got from women and men in 2020 versus 2016. Right? Not much of a difference. If anything, maybe a little bit better with women, which again is counter to the narrative that this was about kind of machista or like macho kind of Latino men driving this trend towards Trump. Looking at age, similar story here where maybe among younger voters, Trump actually did a little bit better, got some more votes from that group, accounting for turnout changes and changes in the composition of the population. But again, nothing statistically significant here. And then ancestry, and this is where I think there's something kind of maybe interesting happening. Cuban Americans, for example, a reliably Republican voting bloc in the Latino population, Trump basically did the same with Cuban Americans as he did back in 2016. With Mexicans, who are again about 70% of the Latino voting eligible population is of Mexican origin, maybe did a little bit better, but again, a lot of uncertainty there. Puerto Ricans, though, a population that grew a lot, which again, simple percentage measure wouldn't pick this up because of Hurricane Maria, because of migration from Puerto Rico to Florida, New York, other places. Again, Puerto Ricans are citizens, right, at birth, and immediately upon arrival they can vote. Actually, maybe Trump made some gains, some losses there. It's below the 0 line, so Biden might have actually done a little bit better with that surge in the Puerto Rican population than Clinton did in 2016. But overall, little evidence here that the gains were driven by those kind of simple demographic factors. The place we do see some demographic changes is on things like income. This is by income quantile in 2016 versus 2020. What we see is that Trump made disproportionate gains among low-income Latinos in particular. People in the first quintile here, the lowest income group, right? I think making less than $20,000 or $15,000 for Latinos only. That's where Trump made a lot of gains, again, relative to his performance in 2016. Education, similar story. While just insignificant statistically, the no college, that is the non-college Latino population, is where Trump made his gains. If anything, Biden did better among those college-educated Latinos than he did in 2016. And then immigrant generation, here's also where we see something contrary to the narrative. CES has great data on your generation among immigrants who naturalized, basically no difference relative to 2016. That first generation, though, that is the children of immigrants, first-gen U.S. born, Trump made gains relative to 2016. Second, third, fourth generation, long-standing Latino populations, we don't see any evidence that that's where Trump was winning more votes. It was among the children of immigrants, who again, under the narratives that we hear in the media, should have been least receptive to Trump's immigration platform and actions, given that that's their parents, right? Oftentimes, who are immigrants. So low SES Latinos disproportionately shifted to Trump, and second generation, that is US-born children of immigrants, again, shifted to Trump in 2020. I can't tell you how many times I talk to consultants and they say, how do we win over the US-born children of immigrants? We're going to run ads that say Trump is going after your parents. They shifted towards Trump in 2020 in larger numbers than any other generational group. Okay, now here's where we start seeing something that fits more with the political science literature, but also tells you something about the Latino population and their voting trends. Whether looking at party or ideology, we see polarization. That is, relative to 2016, Trump did substantially better with Republican Latinos, and Biden did better with Democratic Latinos. What does that mean? It means that Republican Latinos who were cross-pressured, voted for Clinton in 2016, ended up voting for Trump in 2020. And the very few Democratic Latinos who voted for Trump in 2016 switched and voted for Biden in 2020. Same on ideology, whether you measure it in terms of liberal versus conservative, same pattern, which is that Latino voters kind of came home or regressed to the mean. If anything, Latino voters look more like non-Latinos or white voters in their behavior in terms of the correlation between party ideology and who you vote for. Now, when looking at policy, we see a similar pattern that points to the potential of longer-term gains here among Republicans. This is, among Latinos, looking at whether or not they favor conservative crime policy. The first quintile here would be the least likely Latinos to favor conservative crime policy, and the questions are things like, do you think police should be forced to turn on body cameras, but also, do you think police funding should be increased, even if it means fewer social services? Or do you think that police should basically have qualified immunity or not? For Latinos who strongly disagree with all of those statements, therefore who favor defunding the police, for example, Biden did really well among them. But for Latinos with more conservative predilections regarding crime policy, Trump made disproportionate gains. His harsh rhetoric, law and order rhetoric, won him more votes from Latinos. Similar story with immigration restrictionism. We look here, the fourth quintile would be the most restrictionist Latinos who favor, for example, building a border wall with federal funding, restricting legal immigration. That's where Trump made disproportionate gains. Among more moderate Latinos on immigration, we see that Biden did better. Basically no difference here among the most liberal on immigration because almost none of them were supporting Trump anyway. But the story is, again, a polarization on crime and immigration, indicating it's not because, or not despite Trump's rhetoric on immigration and crime, the Latinos voted for him in 2020. It's because of his rhetoric on those issues that they voted for him. Right? That's what I'm saying there. Voting for Trump because of his immigration stance, not despite his immigration stance. Okay. Where were Republican gains most obvious? The third part here, I don't know how many of you follow the New York Times or Upshot, and Nate Cohn, friend of mine, good guy, always forces them to make these maps with the arrows. I've seen them so many times, I know how to read it, but just so we're clear on it, the red arrows indicate a shift in the Republican direction in 2020 relative to 2016. The length of the arrow is how much shift there was. Blue would mean a shift away from Trump, so that is toward Biden relative to Clinton in 2016. From here, kind of in Atlanta, we see a big kind of blue shift, right? But look at Texas, right? These really like long arrows in South Texas is where the Mexican-American Latino community is concentrated in South Texas. Also, South Florida, large Cuban and other Caribbean and South American Latino immigrant and children of immigrant populations. That's what everyone was talking about on election night. People said, the polls are wrong. No way that's true. How could that be true? Well, it was true. To verify this, I'm using individual level voter records here. Have this for basically all states, about 143 million individual level records. This is validated turnout once again, modeling race or ethnicity when necessary. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Combining this with the election results at the neighborhood or precinct level, looking at change, tract level data, census covariates. We've got a lot of moving parts in here. The bottom line is those arrows basically caught on to something really powerful going on with shifting vote preference among Latinos, in particular in heavily Latino areas where we can know for sure that Latinos were producing those shifts. So this is about a 60,000 person or a 60,000 observation data set I'm working with, tract level census data that's like the neighborhood at a very, very fine level of geographic aggregation. Happy to talk about it more in the Q&A if you're interested. This is a lot of fun to model. Okay. Each of these kind of dark points, and where they're more dense is where there's more of them, each of those is a census tract in the country for basically every state. So about 60,000 observations. The blue line here is a smoother, basically the rolling average, moving average of the percent supporting Trump versus Biden, the two-way support in actual votes cast in the census tract as a function of, here on the x-axis, the percent of 2020 voters who were Latino. Because we have vote-validated data, we know that this is Latino voters driving it, not just population. And what we see is a kind of curvilinear relationship. In places with very few Latinos, Trump did a lot better. Those places might be heavily white, could be heavily African-American too, particularly at the bottom here. But the point is that as the Latino population grows, a census tract becomes less likely to vote for Trump in 2020. Not more likely. However, the relationship might be curvilinear. Right around the 50% mark, where Latinos make up half or more of the tract, we can see Trump starts doing a little bit better. Still not as well as he did in these super non-Latino, probably heavily white census tracts, where he got 60 to 70% of the vote, but marginally better than these more diverse tracts. If we isolate Florida, we can see that these dots here, where Trump did really well and were heavily Latino in 2020, almost all of them were in Florida. In fact, every single census tract where Trump got a majority of the vote in 2020 was in Florida, right? Every single heavily Latino census tract where Trump got a majority in the vote was in Florida and in South Florida, Cuban populations. This is, red line is a relationship in Florida where it's strongly curvilinear. Heavily Latino or heavily white means more Trump support. Everywhere else it flattens out. That entire curve in the previous chart is because of Florida, right? It's all Florida doing the action there. Statistically, if you said more Latinos, that means less support for Trump, not more. So we have to be real about the situation. But if we rescale this to be relative to 2016, that's where we start to see the patterns that the arrows show. This is saying relative to how much vote Trump got in 2016, where did he make the most gains? Positive means he gained, negative means he lost votes. There, it's basically a straight line. The more Latino a place was, the better Trump did relative to 2016. That is, he gained at basically every level here, the more Latino voters there were in a census tract. This is not just Florida, right? He outperformed as much as 20 percentage points in some heavily Latino census tracts relative to 2020. This is a real shift in Latino voting behavior that we can see in the geographic data. Texas is a big contributor of it. In fact, if you look here, the red line is the average in Texas. We can see those huge gains in Trump vote share relative to 2016 are in Texas. Florida, not so much. Basically a straight line because Trump did better everywhere in Florida, not just in heavily Latino places. Okay. This is looking at the actual change in votes cast, and I think tells a really interesting story for people who are interested in getting in consulting, for example. One of the things that I teach in my elections classes is that when you're trying to formulate a campaign, you think about it in terms of how many votes you need, right? How many votes you need in order to win office. And relative to a previous election, it's how many more or fewer votes do you need, right? Vote target is what we call that. The blue bars here, and this is for California, Florida, other states, and Texas, only heavily Latino census tracts. The blue bars represent, the darker one, Biden's number of votes drawn from heavily Latino tracts. The light blue is Clinton's votes in heavily Latino census tracts. If I was a Democratic consultant and just saw, which I'm not, just saw the blue bars, I'd say, looks pretty good. Vote totals just about the same. Maybe a little bit lower in a few places like Florida relative to 2016, right? But pretty good and making some good gains in California. The problem is the red bars. The darkest one, right here, which is hard to see on this chart, is Trump in 2020. The kind of middle one is Trump in 2016. Trump doubled his vote share, number of votes, in many of these heavily Latino census tracts. Still doing a lot worse than Democrats did, but getting twice as many, that is tens of thousands of votes more from heavily Latino places relative to his performance in 2016. So the gain that we saw for Trump, new voters being activated, might not have led to him winning many of these heavily Latino census tracts, but again, winning 10,000 votes here, 20,000 votes there from primarily Latino voters. So this Latinos for Trump, the conclusion has to be in 2020, this is a real thing, not just astroturfing. This is a real phenomenon that we see verified in the data. So the takeaways so far, it's not 2020 specific. It looks like it's mostly kind of the usual suspects overall in terms of who voted for Trump: conservatives, low socioeconomic status, immigration restrictionists, but in this case, Latinos, not whites, who are shifting in the Republican column. Heavily Latino census tracts really did see disproportionate shifts towards Trump. It's not a mirage. Latino voters supported Trump more, especially in heavily Latino areas of the country where we can be really certain what's going on. Implications here, again, Latinos are shifting because of Trump's immigration rhetoric and policy, not despite that, and political scientists might be overstating how durable Latino attachments are. But last part of the talk, and then I'll finish and open it for questions, I want to talk about whether Republicans will continue to make gains 2022 and beyond. Now, I'm from Georgia, not originally, but this is where I live and teach now. After the 2020 election, before I started showing this research to people, Republicans were really confident in those gains with Latinos and said, we are going to double down on that Latino support in particular. Black support too increases, is about a 3% increase, but Latinos in particular, by doing things like community outreach. Gwinnett County, the most heavily Latino county in Georgia, right outside of Atlanta, Republicans built what they called here, and this is a picture of their grand opening, a Republican National Committee Hispanic Community Center, funded by the Republican Party, where Latinos could get services, food, community events, that kind of thing, opening in a heavily Latino neighborhood to try and say, Republicans are here and want your votes, but also doing conventional community outreach. The Democrats don't have a community outreach center in Gwinnett County that's focused on Latinos at very least. In addition, in the lead up to 2022, it seemed like Republicans were doubling down, in particular with Latinas, with running Latinas in competitive districts in Virginia, in Florida, in Texas, in Georgia, and other places too, California as well, contesting office, conservative, conventional Republicans who just happen to be Latina. Yet, The 2022 narrative that we all heard at the end of the day was not Republicans make gains with all these Latino voters. It was instead Biden defied expectations and the Democrats held on, right, to the Senate, kept it very close in the House. Now, I'm going to focus here in the last part of the talk on Texas for a few reasons. One is because Texas is the only state where I have good data. Second thing is because the Republicans really did double or triple down on the strategy of recruiting Latinos to elected office or to candidacy for Congress in 3 districts in the Rio Grande Valley, the most heavily Latino part of the state. They ran 3 Latina Republicans. Mayra Flores, who actually won a special election in July of 2022 to represent the district, Monica de la Cruz, and Cassie Garcia, right? 3 Latinas, right? All descendants of immigrants. Mayra Flores herself was an immigrant from Mexico. They were called the 3 Amigas in the Washington Examiner, which is the more conservative-leaning newspaper in Washington, D.C. And here they are, Monica de la Cruz, Mayra Flores, and Cassie Garcia, here at Trump's border wall, 2 of them wearing Border Patrol hats, right? The old Border Patrol logo there on their hats. And all 3 of them had ties to ICE, to the Border Patrol. 2 of them were married to Border Patrol agents. Again, not running from Trump's immigration stance, embracing it as a key part of their campaigns. Now, for now, we have limited data on Latino voting patterns in 2022. The CES survey for 2022 is set to be released soon. As I was joking with some of your faculty here, this morning, as I was finishing my talk, I got an email in my inbox saying, "It's out now. I'm sorry, though, I don't have that data in here to show you." I wasn't going to make that change. Individual and precinct level results also pending, but we do have Texas data over a nice time span, including 2022. Precinct level data, and the question is whether 2022 looks more like 2020 or like those previous normal election cycles for the Latino population. So just one chart to show you here. This might be a little bit hard for folks in the back. Each of these kind of light gray dots here is a precinct in Texas. This is Texas only, the percent voting Republican, and this is looking across 6 election cycles. The moving average, similar to the other charts, percent Latino in the precinct, and then share voting Republican in the precinct. We can see in all cases, the more Latino a precinct is, the less likely it was to vote for Trump. But at the end here, the most heavily Latino precincts is where we see a divergence in these trends. 2020 is the red line, 2022 is the pink line. Other elections before 2020 are the blue and gray lines. We can see those all lumped together, but 2022 is almost exactly the same as 2020. Now, the 3 Amigas, well, only one Amiga now, only one of those candidates won office in a heavily Trump district, by the way, as well, that was created in the Valley. But the overall trends in 2022 looked a lot more like 2020, at least in Texas, than they did in pre-2020 cycles, right? Now, the last thing I want to show you here, I'm really thinking this is last. Maybe there's a few more. They'll be good, though, I promise. This is Mayra Flores' campaign ad, a flyer that people received in their mailboxes in her district for her special election. She had the same platform in November, though. What did she talk about? Is she running away from Trump's immigration stance? No. Moving us forward, stop out-of-control spending to end inflation, conventional Republican. Secure the border, conventional Republican, but interesting, not running away. Expand, not limit access to health care. Here's where the messages are interesting. Protect Texas's oil and energy jobs, right? But fully fund Border Patrol and law enforcement, immigration, crime policy, not running away, embracing. Make our schools safer, interesting given what happened in Uvalde, right, around this time as well. But if you look here, she says, America today is not as it should be. Gas prices skyrocketing, baby formula is missing. American dream is slipping away for future generations. She knows everything's on the line. Put South Texas first. Mother and wife of a Border Patrol agent, right? An immigrant herself, too. This mixing, right, this combining is embracing, again, the rhetoric and doing the exact opposite of what I was taught Republicans need to do to win Latino votes. So what does the future hold? Let me return to this moment in 2018. briefly, and then I'll close. The tear gassing, launching of tear gas by ICE agents over the US-Mexico border towards migrants seeking amnesty, right, was seen for many immigration activists in particular as kind of a watershed moment in what it was going to mean in terms of immigration policy and the treatment of immigrants under Donald Trump. Well, he wasn't able to deport all immigrants or all undocumented immigrants as he claimed he would during the campaign, was never able to get congressional support for it. He was able to accost, effectively, migrants massing at the border. This migrant family in particular from Honduras, right, coming up through Mexico, right, seeking asylum, escaping persecution and crime in Central America. Joe Biden taking office again, doing worse with Latinos than Hillary Clinton did, but still winning the vast majority of Latino voters, campaigned on promises of reforming immigration, of passing immigration reform finally, after failing to do so during the Obama years. He has not done that, obviously. In fact, many immigration activists said he's done the opposite, telling migrants after Kamala Harris said, do not come here, right, stay home. Joe Biden doubled down. Do not just show up at the border to seek amnesty, which is a legal process, by the way, by international law, saying do not do this. In fact, just last month, saying that they were going to prevent migrants from petitioning for protection if they didn't seek safe haven in another country while on their way to the US border. I'm highlighting this because it's a shift in Democratic kind of talking points on immigration, saying he's going to continue the Trump practice of denying asylum to migrants massing at the border unless they're Mexican, right? So this is an interesting part. Central American migrants, the migrant caravans that Trump talked about, predominantly from Central America, some from southern Mexico, that's who's targeted by this. And that you had to seek safe haven in Mexico because it's a country intermediate with the US. Mexican migrants who share national origin with the Mexican-American communities on the border, right, where there's more linked fate perhaps, that's a group not targeted by this. So if anything, the future looks like kind of a mix, I would say. Perhaps though, Democrats realizing this shift in the Latino electorate and seeking to counter Trump's gains with more conservative messaging of their own. Okay, that's what I have for you. I'm looking forward to Q&A and more discussion about this important topic. I thank again Dickinson, Clark Forum, the Andrews Lecture Series, and everyone here for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now begin the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Because it is being live streamed, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We'll be running around with those mics. Also, out of respect for limited time and also the questions of other audience members, we ask that you try and keep your questions relatively brief and hand the microphone back after asking those questions. We also always reserve the first question for students, but after that point, everyone is welcome and encouraged to ask questions. So at this point, we are looking for our first question.
Thank you again, seriously, for a very insightful presentation. So the last example that you were giving about how it sort of benefited northern Mexicans is, in a way, is Mexico being used as like a second border to prevent Central Americans from even getting to Mexico to then get to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, right? And something that during the Trump presidency, many Democrats criticized the Mexican government, AMLO's government, Obrador's government, for basically seeming to align himself, or at least go along with Trump's plan to create a kind of second border, internal to Mexico as well, but especially on the southern border of Mexico with, Central America, right? With Guatemala in particular. I think people were surprised that Joe Biden has essentially seemed to, at least in terms of asylum seekers, continue with that policy. So I think that's right. That's effectively what he's doing. Now, that could change, and the argument now that he would make, because Republicans control the House, is there's no way that immigration reform can pass the House. So it can't pass in Congress. He doesn't have anything to sign, so he's got to do what he's got to do. But it's an interesting, thing to think about given the beginning of the Obama presidency, where there were the same discussions about immigration reform that didn't lead to a lot of movement. Some executive orders, obviously DACA and DAPA, which were very important and still are important today, despite legal pressure. But I think there's a pattern here. And I think Latino voters on the border, in Texas in particular, also in Florida, see that pattern about whether Democrats can follow through with meaningful immigration reform versus Republicans. Thank you.
Hi,
Hey.
Thank you for coming. It's a really interesting presentation. My question is, in Mayra Flores's campaign ad, she talked about how she was a legally immigrated American in the first sentence.
Yeah.
Do you think that since theoretically only citizens who legally immigrated to the US are allowed to vote, it is kind of a little bit of they think they did it correctly and they don't want to see others do it what they would call incorrectly? Do you think that could play any factor into it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a long-standing narrative in border communities in particular, but more broadly debates within the Latino community regarding immigration. Well, my family did it the legal path, so therefore they should too. In South Texas, I believe Mayra Flores specifically in an interview cited the fact that she had to wait to migrate. I'm not sure the veracity of that statement, but the fact that people in her community have to wait 15 years to migrate legally, even with family reunification, which Trump tried to end, by the way. But even with family reunification, so therefore, people massing at the border, they're seeking amnesty, but if we imagine them being undocumented migrants, right, they're trying to do it the wrong way. So this has been a long-standing narrative. And her emphasis of being a legal immigrant, I think, inoculates her among a certain subset of the Latino population from being anti-immigrant. She's saying, I favor immigration, just not undocumented or illegal immigration. Now, all of this is complicated by the fact that today, and since the pandemic in particular, we're really talking about people seeking amnesty, which is legal, and families, right? The family detention practices that we saw, not just during Trump, during the Obama administration as well, but that was controversial because it was people, again, fleeing persecution, or at least who have the international right to hear their cases heard before being deported. But in general, yes, this has been a long-standing talking point among Republicans that they favor immigration, just legal immigration, but now they have the embodiment of that in a candidate like Mayra Flores, again, who is in a Border Patrol family, effectively preventing people from migrating illegally.
Thank you. I appreciate a lot of your nuanced takes. My question is that how much have you looked into the case of incumbency, since that Clinton did a lot better with Latino voters in '96, Obama did better in 2012. Have you looked into that maybe being a reason why Trump did better in 2020 versus 2016, the case of incumbency?
Yeah, this is a great question and a great point, right? When we started this project, a lot of the narratives that were out there about Trump doing better or likely to do better among Latinos, like the polling data pre-election, was, well, Latinos tend to favor incumbents for some reason. There were some narratives about, well, Latinos are on average lower socioeconomic status or lower levels of education, so maybe they just happen to favor incumbents naturally or something like that. We didn't see that same pattern with other groups, so it seems like there's something specific to voters of color in that, but it's possible, right? We don't have the counterfactual election where, well, until 2024, where Trump is on the ballot but is not the incumbent, right? Even there, he, has served in office before, but it's a good point. It's something that we don't see among other groups. That's kind of the evidence against that hypothesis, but it's possible. Now, the 2022 data that I have from Texas, those are midterm elections, right? Mayra Flores lost despite being the incumbent. The patterns look more similar to 2020, despite Trump not being on the ballot. Latino support for Abbott was not great, but perhaps stronger than we might expect, even despite him being an incumbent. So I don't see a lot of evidence in that direction, but it's certainly possible that there's still some lingering Trump support because he's a known quantity. And that's the incumbent story. Thanks.
So one of the things that you mentioned at the start was that there are reasons to think that Republicans have some latent support among Latino voters, and you mentioned Roman Catholicism.
Sure.
And so my class is on religion and American politics, and they're here tonight, and one of the things that we've studied are the differences in political behavior between white Catholics and Latino Catholics, and we've looked at those things over time as well, with the story of white Catholics being declining Democratic dominance. And so I was just wondering if you had any ability to reflect on the role of religiosity in the gains that you have identified in 2020 and 2022.
Yeah, I don't have the slide in this version of the talk anymore. It was already too long. But we looked at differences by denomination in terms of Trump making gains, and we didn't see significant differences across, except for the fact that Biden did better or got more net votes, is really what I should be saying, in 2020 from atheist or agnostic Latinos relative to 2016, but those populations are also growing. So given the way that we're calculating that metric, he got more Latino votes from that subset, but it's mostly because that group has grown in size over time. I will say that, again, this is the narrative about potential for latent gains. The growth of the evangelical Protestant Latino population was seen as like target number one for Republicans, specifically because of abortion. When we looked at preferences related to reproductive, rights or access or freedom, right, and how that shifted, we didn't see any differences there either. So there could be mobilization. I think there needs to be more study about how actual mobilization within the church, right, within evangelical versus Catholic churches operates. But, my family, which is from South Texas, Mexican American, I remember, my grandma, who's passed away now, but talking about how the priest, during the homily was saying you have to vote for W in 2004 because of abortion, because otherwise, the Democrats are going to kill babies. And that was, again, supposed to be the narrative about how Republicans win Latino votes. That still is out there. Maybe that'll come out more in 2024. But it doesn't seem like that was a source of disproportionate gains this time around.
I'll give you free rein to just elaborate any way you would like on the beyond part of your lecture.
Yeah.
Expand a little bit more on 2024 and beyond in any way you would like.
Obviously, the big question in 2024, I think, if is Trump going to be the nominee for the Republicans? I think that if he is the nominee, I think he's a front runner to be the nominee right now, despite everything that's maybe happening as we sit here regarding potential, prosecution and arrest or whatever. I don't think, as I said in class earlier today, I don't think that's going to matter. At the end of the day, if he wins the nomination, I think that he'll do very well. I don't think he'd necessarily beat Joe Biden, but I think he'd definitely beat a Democrat if it wasn't Joe Biden, because if it's not going to be Joe Biden, that means there's a major problem within the Democratic Party. Even if it's a health-related thing, it would mean there's a lot of stuff going on. I think Donald Trump understands that he did better among Latinos despite everything that he did, maybe because of the things he did related to immigration. So I think it would lead to I use this term too much, triple down or whatever on his immigration rhetoric, quadruple down, I don't know what you would say, where he just say exactly what he's been saying. He's been consistent, right? He wants to curb immigration, legal and undocumented, change the nature of the immigration system, and he's going to win some Latino votes doing that, especially if it involves constructing a very, very large wall on the US-Mexico border, primarily by Latino children of immigrants who are going to be the ones doing the building and then doing the enforcing on the border. I don't know what Ron DeSantis would do. He seems to understand really well the Latino community in Florida. He gets pretty decent support from them. I don't know how well that translates to other places, but I'm not sure that would really matter. Florida is not really a swing state anymore. Texas is not a swing state yet either. So I think the question is more whether you just see this weird thing that puzzles political scientists about how Trump is still doing well among Latinos in 2024, or people kind of ignore Latino voters because I don't think they're concentrated in real swing states, outside of Arizona perhaps, in a way where it's relevant to the outcome. So that was a long-winded way of saying this might matter in the way that I'm describing, or it doesn't matter at all. We'll find out. But I've been wrong before, so I could be wrong about that too. And there's some fungus like circulating, the CDC was reporting, so maybe we'll have another pandemic and everything will change. How's that for lack of optimism at 8 p.m.? Yeah, just joking, it'll be fine.
Is it my turn?
Wash your hands.
So thank you very much, Dr. Fraga. I want to highlight, number one, I'm not a student, obviously. I am a teacher, and I think this is fascinating, very well done, comprehensive analysis. Thank you very much. I'm also going to give you a shout out and say, mi madre es de Mexico.
Oh, okay.
My parents my mom's from South Texas. I have literally stood, as you probably have, on the grounds, on the border right there on the Rio Grande, some property that my family owns, and I won't editorialize, it's a crossing point. Mm-hmm. So I do want to ask you, not a partisan question, but obviously you mentioned, partisans look toward vote targets, and maybe in a minute I'll tell you who I am. A lot of people in here already know. Vote targets and messaging and 2024, and you just gave a great analysis of that. So one of the things I'm thinking about is messaging beyond this year. But I'll give you a data point, and this is really for everybody. In February, and I guess this is maybe a point of optimism for those that identify as Democrats. In February in York, there was a CASA groundbreaking. It's an advocacy group, I'm sure you know, for Latino Americans. Senator Casey came in virtually, and he said, among other things, hey, I'm so happy to have been able to give you a $1.4 million grant to build this place. And then he went on to talk about Dreamers and about comprehensive immigration reform. And in the building, I also saw a blackboard or bulletin board that had a Black Lives Matter poster and a hashtag DACA. So I think the point I'm making is I think maybe there's some learning going on here. So given all that, I'll just tell you very quickly, my name is Rick Copeland. I'm an elected school board member here and a once and potentially future congressional candidate to represent the hallowed ground on which we stand. So given all that, I'm just asking messaging. Obviously, Senator Casey's highlighting something I think important. So what do you think?
So jobs, economy. I think that's a lesson that, every time I think, the Democrats have learned it, and the Republicans too, they forget it. It's really strange. Jobs, economy, right? Economic gain. I think the story in Texas, and South Texas in particular, right, is as much one about jobs and opportunity and fear of losing jobs and losing opportunity, especially during the pandemic, but even continuing. It's as much that as it is anything else. There's fears of crime, other things as well, but it's an economic argument. When you look at 2020, COVID-19 was top of the list, but the economy was right up there, and they're interrelated, especially back then. Couldn't really separate it very cleanly, but it's very clear in 2022. The economy is top of mind. Inflation, obviously. Just stick with that. Pick messengers that are culturally conscious, that understand what's going on in communities. Make the effort. Go to the border and talk about the economic issues that people are facing there. That's the winning formula. What surprised me in looking at the data is thinking about the many Democrats and consultants that I talked to about what happened in 2020 and about their strategy and the messaging that we're going to use going forward in 2022 to win back those communities. And they looked at me with blank faces. They're like, we have no idea. And then the answer was, we're not going to win them back anyway because they're conservative. There's nothing we can do. Run the most conservative Latino Democrat we can find. That might be a winning strategy, but I think, again, a broader reanalysis, again, for both parties about, Americans wanting something from their government that empowers them, that makes them feel, especially coming out of the pandemic, like their lives are going to be improved, or at least maybe on the Republican or Libertarian side, the government's going to get out of the way. That's the messaging that seems to resonate no matter what your racial and ethnic group is. And that's especially true in contexts like you're saying, where the likelihood of comprehensive immigration reform is effectively zero. It has been for a while. yeah, don't promise things you can't do, and except on the economy, perhaps. That always seems to work, so, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I guess like looking at Maya Flores's, I guess that little ad, she's got that thing about expanding healthcare.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's like an indication of Latino support for a kind of a broader social safety net, or like, I guess, more governmental involvement in those sorts of things? And like, would you say that that's a way for progressive Democrats to kind of make inroads with the Latino community as they're kind of going more conservative?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's linking it to the economic situation. You know, it's funny, in preparing for this talk, I was listening to interviews with Mayra Flores when she was running for re-election. She's elected in special, and so in November, and you know, what was she saying, right? Because her district, you know, was Democratic leaning, even in 2020. It still favored Biden over Trump by a smaller margin than expected, but still favored Biden over Trump. So she was running in a Democratic-leaning district, so what was her messaging? And on the border, immigration, and crime, it was very standard Republican talking points. But in other things, she was like, you know, we need to make sure that, you know, people have access to health care. I want to expand, right? Government assistance for healthcare programs, things that sounded like Democratic talking points. Now, it didn't work out for her. It was close. Didn't work out. But I do think that we've seen this, I didn't even put it in here, but Republican Latino who was elected in one of these border districts, I'll go back there real quick. I know we have to end. Right here, this huge district in the Bend, right? I forgot his name. Recently censored by the Republican Party for saying something that seemed more like a Democratic talking point. So I think Republicans running conservative Latinos in heavily Latino areas is not always a recipe for success, but it is certainly a recipe for diversifying the ideological positions of Republicans and making, what's his name, Kevin McCarthy's life even more of a nightmare in having to wrangle a diverse set of perspectives within the caucus. So, good point. Thank you.
This concludes tonight's event. Please join me in thanking our speaker one last time.
Thank you all.